Okay, this is the French Revolution by Oxford University Press. France under Louis XVI. Transport costs alone made this inevitable, and contemporaries could not imagine how these could be much diminished. Roads and rivers could be improved, canals built, and some hoped the system of tolls and customs could be rationalized. But until the coming of the railways, which nobody could foresee, resulting benefits would still be marginal. Much more hope was placed in diminishing the burdens on production, which ate into profits. Taxation, for example, might be reorganized so as to take less than the usual 10 to 15% of a peasant's gross product. Tithes destined for the upkeep of the parish clergy, but often impropriated by monasteries or laymen, took around another 8% on average. The corvée, forced labor for road construction and maintenance, took hands away from the fields for substantial periods every year. And when, under Louis XVI, it began to be commuted, the cost was added to the tax bill. Above all, there was the burden of what contemporaries called feudalism. It was infinitely variable, from a few percent around Paris or in Maine, 10% in the Massif, 15% around Toulouse, up to 25% in parts of Brittany or Burgundy. Here and there are a few islands of allodial tenure, free of all burdens, survived from distant times. But in the vast majority of the medieval territories that later became France, there had been no land without a lord. This was still the case under Louis XVI, although by now lordship and ownership had become largely divorced. The feudal rights that lords could exercise over land they might no longer truly own were infinite. They always included a token money rent, cens, but often extended to heavier payments in cash or kind too. Almost invariably, they included hunting and shooting rights. Sometimes they included manorial monopolies, banalités, which compelled producers to use a lord's mill or wine press, and all such rights were normally enforceable through the lord's own court. Even this is to simplify. Many leases blended feudal and ordinary cash rents indiscriminately over much of Brittany under a system known as domaine congeable. Tenants on 9-year leases payable in a mixture of cash and kind were deemed proprietors of the buildings and fruit trees on their plots, could not be evicted unless their landlord bought them out, and so effectively enjoyed permanent tenure. Whether this amounted to ownership and whether it was strictly feudal in character were questions of little practical interest until 1789, when they suddenly assumed crucial and fateful importance. Despite low productivity, antiquated methods, and little sign of improvement, French agriculture had prospered in the middle decades of the century. Increasing demand from an expanding population coincided with a long series of good harvests to bring excellent prices and a sustained rise in rents and land values. From the late 1760s onwards, however, harvests became more uncertain, and yields began to fluctuate sharply. Only 3 harvests between 1770 and 1789 were abundant everywhere, and provinces with shortfalls found it hard to import adequate extra supplies. The wine crop, upon which many peasants relied to supplement inadequate resources, also proved abnormally volatile during these years, failing completely in 1778 and overproducing subsequently. There were shortages in the mid-1780s too of flax and forage crops. Cattle owners unable to feed their stock adequately had to slaughter and sell at rock-bottom prices, since everybody was doing the same. None of this dented the rise in rents and land values. Landlords and big farmers continued to do well, but for the small proprietors, leaseholders, and sharecroppers who dominated French agriculture, the reign of Louis XVI was to prove a time of difficulty and disruption. And because agriculture was far and away the most important economic activity in the kingdom, the shock waves were felt throughout economic life. There was, in fact, no clear distinction between agricultural and industrial workers. Most industry was rurally based. Even ostensibly urban trades like construction a major growth industry that was transforming the appearance of Paris and greater provincial cities, were largely dependent on migrant workers who took their earnings home to the country each winter. Metallurgy, scarcely yet affected by coal and coke technology, was a business of small-scale concern, located in remote forests where charcoal was plentiful. It is true that the biggest industry of all, textiles, was centered on cities, woolens on Amiens, Abbeville, Sedan, or Clermont de Lodève, cottons on Rouen and Elbeuf, silk on Nimes and Lyon. But only in Lyon was much actual production concentrated in the town. The other textile towns were primarily markets, centers of distribution and finance, with most of their spinning and weaving carried on in peasant households, anything up to 50 miles distant. Around Rouen, that meant that perhaps 300,000 peasants were involved in cotton production. But if most of the industrial workforce were peasants, so were most of the consumers. And when harvests failed, they had less money to spend on clothing themselves, or indeed on other manufactures. So demand fluctuated according to the harvests. And this made Louis XVI's reign an uncertain time in industrial as well as agricultural terms. The silk industry of Lyon lurched from crisis to crisis. Markets for woolens and linens became extremely erratic too. Only cottons continued the sustained expansion that all textiles had experienced in mid-century. And this was because their main markets were not in France, but abroad in southern Europe and the tropical colonies. France did not have many such colonies by the 1770s. The British had practically expelled her from India in mid-century, and elsewhere east of the Cape, only the Ile-de-France, Mauritius, and the Ile Bourbon, Réunion, were still in her hands. In the Caribbean, she had managed to hang on to Martinique, Guadeloupe, and above all, Saint Domingue, present-day Haiti. But the value of these tropical islands was out of all proportion to their size. At the Peace of Paris in 1763, Louis XV had been glad to give up the whole of Canada in order to get back Guadeloupe. And on the eve of the Revolution, Saint Domingue was the richest piece of territory in the world. Colonial wealth derived from the production of sugar, coffee, and other tropical luxuries by the labor of black slaves. There were 500,000 of them in Saint Domingue alone, and transporting replacements from Africa was yet another aspect of a complex Atlantic trading network whose nerve centers were the great seaports. Thanks largely to the output of these colonies, France's overseas trade grew fivefold over the century, and the booming population, lavish rebuilding, and crowded harbors of Bordeaux, Nantes, Le Havre, and even Mediterranean Marseille testified to their prosperity. Nor, unlike the rest of the economy, did it show much sign of flagging, except during the war with Great Britain between 1778 and 1783. Even then, British action did far less damage than in previous wars, and when peace was restored, the boom reached new heights. But not much of this commercial opulence reached far inland. The real profits of the colonial trade came from re-exporting the precious luxuries to the ports of northern Europe. Even when trading profits were reinvested in land, as they often were, it was to secure assets rather than put them to further productive use. There were, therefore, two French economies, only tenuously linked: coastal regions and the navigable lower reaches of the four great river systems were integrated with international and intercontinental trading networks and shared in their benefits, which seemed destined to go on improving. But most of Louis XVI's subjects lived in the interior, where communications were poor, economic life sluggish, and such improvements as good harvests had brought in mid-century were being eroded by climatic deterioration and an inexorably rising population. The famines of the 17th century, when hundreds of thousands died, were fading from memory. But thinking men became increasingly worried as each harvest shortfall plunged whole populations into beggary about the ability of existing institutions to take the strains they were coming under. Poverty was France's most visible social problem. Nobody could overlook it. All travelers noticed the misery of rural housing and the poor appearance of the peasantry. All the country girls and women, noted Arthur Young in Corsi, are without shoes or stockings, and the plowmen at their work have neither sabots nor stockings to their feet. This is a poverty that strikes at the root of national prosperity. It reminded me of the misery of Ireland. Bands of roving vagabonds struck terror into the hearts of isolated farmers. And the streets of most towns swarmed with beggars. The poor, meaning those who, without adequate employment or other assured means of support, numbered at the best of times almost a third of the population, 8 million people. In bad times, 2 or 3 millions more might join them, as crops failed and jobs disappeared. Most of the poor were people too old or too young or too ill to earn their living. People whose families could not afford to feed them either. But as the population grew, increasing numbers of the able-bodied also had difficulty in finding work or enough of it to make ends meet. Over the century, prices rose 3 times faster than wages. Workmen today, wrote Jean-Marie Roland, inspector of manufactures in Picardy in 1777, need twice as much money for their subsistence, yet they earn no more than 50 years ago when living was half as cheap. The result was described by a Norman parish priest. Day laborers, workmen, journeymen, he wrote in 1774, and all those whose occupation does not provide for much more than food and clothing are the ones who make beggars. As young men they work, and when their work they have got themselves decent clothing and something to pay their wedding costs, they marry, raise a first child, have much trouble in raising 2, and if a 3rd comes along, their work is no longer enough for food and the expense. At such a time, they do not hesitate to take up the beggar's staff and take to the road. Often that road would lead to the town, which offered, or so it was hoped, more opportunities for work. Most town dwellers were country people by birth who had left their overpopulated villages early in life in search of a livelihood. The death rate in the insanitary towns was so high, especially among children, that they could not have flourished without this steady inflow of man and woman power. And even if no work materialized, in towns, immigrants could find monasteries and convents distributing alms, hospitals, and poor houses endowed to take in and relieve those no longer able to fend for themselves, and more chance of private charity than in native villages where everyone was as poor as themselves. Yet, when they arrived, all too many immigrants found that none of these resources was remotely adequate. Under Louis XVI, they were in fact becoming steadily less adequate, and not merely because of mounting claims on their services. Monasteries were cutting back on bread doles under criticism that indiscriminate charity fostered idleness. Hospitals and poorhouses found the charitable bequests on which they had always relied dwindling, and as ecclesiastical institutions they were cut off from further endowments by legislation of 749 restricting mortmain. Revenues from investment in government securities suffered as a result of state bankruptcies and debt consolidations over the century, while inflation eroded the amount of supplies hospitals could afford from their shrinking resources. Here and there, concerned laymen began later in the century to experiment with new approaches to poor relief. Masonic lodges set up charitable funds, and in several cities, philanthropic societies were established in the 1780s to tap the wealth of the rich for the poor. The government began gingerly to toy with schemes of relief on a national scale, such as the establishment of workhouses, dépôts de mendicité, in each generality from the 1760s, and charitable workshops, ateliers de charité, from the 1770s. The background to these departures was more mounting public concern about the problem of the poor. Vigorous debates in the press, in the world of letters, and in learned societies and academies testified to the worries of educated men that they faced a crisis that would soon be beyond control. These fears were fueled by the way the poor behaved. Naturally, they took what work they could find, but when they failed, they turned to begging without shame. The sheer professionalism of many beggars made those they assailed suspect their good faith. And indeed, faked ailments and hard luck stories were common enough. Anything that made the better off pay up was worth trying. When appeals to pity failed, intimidation might work better. And from there, it was a very short step to crime. Petty theft was every pauper's standby. Another was smuggling in a land crisscrossed by countless tolls and internal customs barriers. In the country, there was poaching. In town, women in desperate straits became prostitutes, despite the fact that this almost invariably led to disease and further degradation. In the 1760s, There were 25,000 prostitutes in Paris. The classic pattern was for a girl newly arrived from the country to be taken on as a maid, become pregnant, lose her job, and take to the streets to feed the child. Alternatively, she might abandon it. And not only unmarried mothers adopted this way out of feeding an extra mouth. One of the most graphic indicators of the growth in poverty was the rise in the number of foundlings and abandoned children. They tripled over the century. By the 1780s, perhaps 40,000 a year was the national figure. In Paris alone, it was about 8,000. And even a small provincial town like Bayeux, with 10,000 inhabitants, produced about 50 annually. The hospitals who took such babies in could not possibly cope with their numbers. They tended to farm them out to wet nurses, themselves usually poverty-stricken. And in these hands, the majority were dead before their 5th birthday. Better off observers thought all this was evidence of increasing moral depravity among the lower orders, and they agonized over how far it was safe to try to educate them out of it. Yet, the heart of the matter was that the French economy could not provide a decent living for all the people being born in the countryside. Peasants accounted for 80% of the French population. Only a fifth of Louis XVI's subjects lived in communities of more than 2,000 people. A good 250,000 probably lived in no community at all. A floating population of vagrants, feared and despised by more settled folk, an awful warning of what might happen at any time to millions who lived on or just beyond the poverty line. The livelihood of most peasant families was an amalgam of makeshifts. Even those with land seldom had enough. So, like the landless, they were dependent on income from day or seasonal labor, cottage industry, or exporting surplus members of the family to places where work was known or thought to be available. "The only industry the inhabitants have," noted a report on an Auvergne parish in 1769, "is to leave home for 9 months of the year." Yet, paradoxically, families in circumstances like these were the mainstay of rural communities. Not only did they constitute a majority of the inhabitants, they found valuable extra resources in the communal rights, which most villages enjoyed. On common lands, they could pasture a cow and gather firewood. In the open field areas of northern France, they could glean after harvest, and their cattle could graze on the stubble. In some areas, too, especially in the south, there were powerful traditions of communal defense against threats to local customs. Communities could sue lords who tried to levy excessive seigneurial dues or exercise dubious rights. From the 1760s onwards, the enclosure and division of common lands and the termination of collective rights was authorized in many eastern and certain southwestern districts. But little was done to take advantage of this legislation. Those lords or large landowners tempted to do so were deterred by the obvious readiness of village communities to fight the issue through the courts, not to mention by riots or other more passive ways of resisting. Similar tactics could be employed against the tithe gatherers, especially when the proceeds went to lay or monastic impropriators rather than the parish priest for whom God had ordained them. The curé, after all, was an important figure in every village. In most, he was probably the only resident of education and authority, a natural leader quite apart from his spiritual power and guardianship of the only common building in most parishes, the church. As such, he was a powerful cement to village solidarity. Traditionally, his most persistent opponents were those who shared least in that solidarity, the small minority of fortunate peasants who owned or leased enough land to be economically independent. So much marked this prosperous handful off from the bulk of their fellow inhabitants. They alone had no fear of ruin if famine or disease struck. They alone in the village had jobs to distribute, since they farmed too much land to work entirely by themselves. Only they owned equipment, carts, and draught animals in any quantity. Others had to hire from them, just as they came to them to borrow seed or ready cash in difficult times. When, as often happened, the hapless debtors could not repay them, they would foreclose and thereby accumulate yet more property. It is true that these were the men whom communities normally nominated as syndics, local tax collectors, or church wardens. But only they had the leisure and resources to shoulder such duties. It was not necessarily any tribute to their popularity. The only solidarity they normally showed with their fellow villagers was in resistance to outsiders, such as gros fermiers who threatened to outbid them for leases, tax-exempt nobles or townsmen whose privilege pushed up everyone else's tax bill if they bought land in the parish, or lords whose hunting and shooting rights, manorial monopolies, or feudal dues and levies in cash or kind damaged the assets and ate into the profits of rich and poor peasants alike. But Coq du Village regarded rich outsiders and lords of the manor primarily in the same light as the parish priest, as rivals for power and authority within the village community. When the opportunity came to strike such rivals down, it was eagerly seized. There was a sense in which this tight-fisted minority of independent yeomen were the truest countrymen. They alone could shun the towns. The rest of rural society was far more bound up with urban life than first appearance might suggest. The majority who could not grow all the food they needed had to buy in local market towns. The networks of cottage industry were organized from towns too, and their products were marketed in them. Few peasant families did not have some member who had worked for a spell in some distant city, or who had migrated there permanently. In all these ways, urban and rural life interlocked. Nor was the distinction between towns and villages always obvious. Animals were raised and pastured and crops grown even in the heart of the most densely populated conurbations. 90% of French towns had less than 10,000 inhabitants, and only 9 cities had more than 50,000. Nevertheless, the 18th century was a period of rapid urban growth. Paris grew by perhaps 100,000 people. Bordeaux and Nantes more than doubled in size. And Lyon and Marseille expanded by more than half. It is true that towns bypassed in the commercial expansion of the century places like Toulouse, Besançon, or innumerable small cities vegetating behind crumbling ramparts unmanned for over a century, had tended to stagnate. But a third more of the French population lived in towns under Louis XVI than at the beginning of the century, and they included nearly all the richest, best educated, and most dynamic of the king's subjects. Even so, most town dwellers were poor, completely unskilled. Urban poverty was concentrated and eye-catching. A pool of labor there was never enough work to drain. complained a Rennes magistrate in 1772, has thrown into the towns people who overburden them with their uselessness and who find nothing to do because there is not enough for the people who live there. From these ranks were recruited the innumerable casual laborers, porters, chairmen, dockers, waiters, shoeshine boys, general dealers, old clothes merchants, and hucksters who could be met in any city street. They lived crowded together in cellars or the upper stories, 4 or 5 floors up in Paris, of lodging houses. When times were hard and they could not pay the rent, they swamped the hospitals and the criminal courts. The lucky ones among unskilled immigrants became domestic servants. Perhaps the largest single occupational group in most towns of any size. In Paris, there were 40 or 50,000 of them. In most provincial cities, they made up anything between 5 and 7% of the population. Sheltered, fed, often clothed, as well as paid by their employers, servants had a privileged existence that other unskilled workers might well envy them. As often as not, in fact, they appear to have despised them, for servants were dependent completely at their master's mercy, with little real life of their own, condemned to celibacy because married servants were expensive and inconvenient. Their proverbial cupidity arose as often as not from saving to buy themselves out of service and into family life. The turnover of servants in most households was notoriously high, suggesting that for all its apparent security, a life of subjection to the whims of the better off brought more than its share of tensions and dissatisfactions. Among the floating population of casual laborers, beggars, petty criminals, and prostitutes of every town, there must have been many who had at some time glimpsed a more fortunate world during a spell in service. They knew what they were missing, and no doubt they felt it all the more acutely from the certain knowledge that they could never hope themselves to break into that world, unless perhaps as burglars. They had little chance either of penetrating the world of skilled craftsmen. Most of these trades were tightly organized, exclusive, and tended to recruit among townsmen born and bred, natives even of the district in which each trade was concentrated. Even trades where immigrants predominated, such as building and stone cutting, recruited largely from well-defined provinces like Limousin. Skills required training, and the organization of most arts and crafts enshrined a hierarchy of attainment. At the bottom were apprentices learning the trade. After 4 or 5 years, they would qualify as journeymen, compagnons, the backbone of all the trades, and in many they would go on to acquire experience by taking to the road. Jacques-Louis Ménétrais, a Parisian glazier, who left a remarkable set of memoirs, spent most of his 20s, between 1757 and 1764, tramping over 1,500 miles from town to town throughout southern France. To facilitate the search for work. At the outset, he joined one of the 3 great craftsmen's unions, Compagnonnage, which helped their members on this Tour de France to find work and accommodation at each stop. But the Compagnonnage had no legal standing and were frowned upon by the authorities everywhere. They were effective organizers of strikes and boycotts, not to mention fierce fights against one another. The officially recognized form of organization for most skilled trades was the guild, Gironde. And technically, nobody could exercise his skill without belonging to the appropriate one. Every town had a clear hierarchy of guilds, each governed by its body of masters. The masters set the standards of their craft. They alone could become independent employers in it. And they were recruited from journeymen who could pay an entry fee and present a masterpiece as proof of their acquired skills. But sons of masters like Ménétrais were at a distinct advantage here. And when he became one after 8 years as a journeyman, he got in without a masterpiece. Much was made of such inequities when guilds had become a thing of the past. But mastership was not an automatic passport to commercial success. And in most guilds, access to it does not appear to have been seriously restricted. Quite the reverse. In the great Silk Workers Guild of Lyon, the 60,000 strong Fabrique, there were more masters than journeymen, while in Paris, between 1785 and 1789 alone, nearly 70,000 new masters nearly 7,000 new masters were admitted to the various guilds of the city, and proliferation of masters meant that most workplaces were small. The average number of workers in Parisian workshops was 16 or 17 in 1789. Although working hours were long, 16 hours a day for 6 days a week being common, most artisans set their own pace of work, and by modern standards it appears to have been an extremely slow and leisurely one. Here and there, more disciplined working environments were emerging. notably textile printing works like that of Christoph Oberkampf, employing almost 1,000 operatives at Jouy, or that of Garnier, Danse, and Thevard, with their 800 employees at Beauvais. In Paris, the most noteworthy early factories of this sort were the Royal Glassworks, employing 500, or Réveillon's Wallpaper Works, with 300 employees, both in the eastern Saint-Antoine district. But their scale, organization, and guild-free atmosphere made such workplaces quite exceptional, and indeed objects of some suspicion. Not only did guilds safeguard traditional standards of quality and workmanship, they offered a well-tried means of keeping workers under control. Even the ever-growing number of free trades, métiers libres, which were not organized into guilds, were subjected to close supervision through an elaborate network of regulations. But doubts about such controls were spreading. In 1776, an attempt was made to abolish the whole structure of guilds, and Parisian artisans celebrated in the streets at the news. A few months later, however, the old structure was largely restored, and in 1781, new controls were introduced in the form of what came to be known as the livrette, a work record which all employees had to carry, and which needed the employer's endorsement whenever they left. Such developments and the slow erosion of real wages caused by 2 generations of inflation made Louis XVI's reign a time of increasing industrial unrest. In insubordination, noted Louis Sébastien Mercier, the author of vivid scenes of Parisian life in the 1780s, has been visible among the people for some years now, and above all among craftsmen. Apprentices and young workers want to show themselves independent. They lack respect for their masters. They form combinations. Their eye caught by increasingly frequent strikes and boycotts, such observers perhaps underestimated the deeper sense of solidarity between masters and their men, fostered by a common craft and cultural background, familiar guild procedures, and the personal atmosphere of small workshops. The most vivid example was in Lyon, where masters and journeymen of the Fabrique united to clash repeatedly with the handful of great merchants who monopolized the buying and marketing of what they produced. And masters and journeymen everywhere were at one in their response to sudden jumps in the cost of living when harvests were deficient. It seldom occurred to artisans at such times to press for higher wages, and it never occurred to masters to pay them. Both and their wives, who often led public protests on these occasions, expected the authorities to hold down food prices without regard to the state of the market. Sudden rises in the price of bread or grain were universally recognized as the most dangerous moments for public order. And towns were the places it was most likely to break down. Even unrest involving peasants tended to occur when they came together in towns on market days. Everybody believed that the price of bread should be controlled and held at a level which ordinary people could afford. When it rose above that level, they felt morally entitled to take action to hold it down. This might involve threatening bakers or corn chandlers, and even lynching those who proved slow to respond. Or mobs might break into shops or warehouses and organize sales of their contents at what they considered a fair or just price. Hoarding in times of scarcity was regarded as the worst of crimes. Alternatively, riotous crowds would try to intimidate local magistrates into fixing acceptable prices, which was seen anyway as nothing less than their duty. Most magistrates readily agreed and kept bread and grain prices within their jurisdiction under weekly review. In the case of Paris, this was considered a matter of national importance. If the capital went hungry, the stability of the state itself might be endangered. And the needs of Paris took priority in all markets within a radius of about 100 miles, and where a powerful influence at up to twice that distance. Even the most careful monitoring, however, could not anticipate every shortage. And although the years of good harvests between the 1740s and 1760s were relatively trouble-free, with the exception of 1752, the decade between 1768 and 1778 brought disturbances in many parts of the country. Harvests were uncertain during these years, and their effects were aggravated by the first attempts of the government to disengage from controlling the grain trade. Partially lifted in the 1760s, controls were reimposed in the early 1770s, and then lifted again in 1775. The effect was to throw prices and expectations into chaos when stocks were short. In 1768, there were riots and popular price fixing in Le Havre and Nantes. In 1770 at Reims, attempts in 1770 to regularize supplies in the hands of a few chosen merchants led to rumors of a famine pact devised by rascally ministers to starve the king's subjects. In any case, The return to controls did not prevent further shortages in 1773, during which Bordeaux narrowly escaped being sacked by hungry mobs. Worst of all, however, was the Flour War of 1775, just before the coronation. Despite the poor harvest of 1774, the minister Turgot insisted on removing all controls in the belief that a free market would best avert shortages. By the spring, bread prices in Paris had risen more than 50%, and riots, which began on 27 April at Beaumont-sur-Oise, 25 miles to the north, spread within a week throughout the Ile-de-France to the gates of the royal palace at Versailles and to the bread markets of the capital itself. It took troops, hundreds of arrests, and 2 public executions to restore order. And by then, much of northeastern France had been disturbed for over 2 weeks. In 1778, it was the turn of several southern cities, Grenoble, Toulouse, Bordeaux again, to witness riots or tensions after harvest shortfalls. And in 1784 and 1785, Normandy, but for a dozen years after the Flour War, Paris was calm. And successive ministries, anxious not to repeat Turgot's mistake, intervened in the grain market to maintain that calm. Only after a bumper harvest in 1787 was the grip relaxed, and then once again it was at just the wrong moment. Yeah, I'll stop there.